Hey, Terry here. Today, I'm going to be sharing my story about changing careers at 50 years old, let you in on why I made that change, the challenges I faced, and 5 important things that I learned in the process that are still relevant today. Now, I've put off making this video for quite a while, but I'm making it now because I know that some of you or someone that you know is probably thinking of making a career change. So I hope that something I say today is going to help you find the direction and the courage that you need to overcome all those challenges that you're facing. All right, let's go back a bit to the 1980s. I was in my 30s. I was working for some major corporations. I started off as a machinist, then later as a draftsman, and then as a quality control technician. Now, back then, I started doing some speaking to small groups on the weekends. Now, that later evolved into a full time speaking career that spanned more than 12 years, 25 states, Canadian provinces, and hundreds of meetings. Now, let's fast forward a little bit to 2004. Life began taking a whole series of unexpected turns. The major thing was my father had developed Alzheimer's. It was now in the final stages, so I started taking speaking engagements a little closer to where he and my mother lived. Now, as his condition rapidly worsened, I completely stopped taking engagements so my wife and I could help with caregiving in the final days of his life. Now, within roughly a year, in addition to the loss of my father, we also lost another 4 family members. So that's 5 family members in about a year's time. This is due to like heart disease and other health complications. Seemed like every time that the phone rang, well, it was just bad news. I was almost 50 years old. By that time, we were broke. We were dealing with overwhelming grief, and it felt like our entire world had just been turned upside down. So we relocated to the area where our families lived. So I thought, as I began to recover from all those losses, well, I'd just go back to my speaking career. But due to the economic downturn, speaking engagements were few and they were far between. So my wife and I started a small business to help keep us afloat. Now, we were doing really well. We were beginning to make some real headway, but when one of our major yearly contracts came up for renewal, we were underbid by a larger company. And so we lost the contract and therefore our salaries. Now we were back to square one. Now the stress was almost unbearable and we had no one to turn to for advice, for help, or for anything. So we took jobs working for a couple of small companies just to sustain ourselves, but the pay was low and the hours were long, and so things were getting really dismal. Now, we were determined that this wasn't going to destroy us financially or emotionally or our marriage or all that stuff. It was painfully obvious that working for smaller companies with no chance of advancement and no benefits just was not going to get us back on our feet. I remember it was on a Friday afternoon, the week following the Christmas holidays, which, by the way, was the absolute worst Christmas that we've ever had in our entire lives, that we drove to a nearby temporary job placement service. I filled out an application on the spot. Now, the guy looked at my work history and he said, "Man, you've got a really impressive background in machine technology." And while I knew I had a lot of experience in that field, well, it was like years ago. I was really hoping that he could help me find something that didn't mean going back into a manufacturing environment, but I was totally willing to take whatever was available. So on the way home, I remember telling my wife, well, I'm going to call that guy every single day till I have a job, even if it's a temporary position. And in the meantime, I'm going to apply for jobs everywhere I can until I find something substantial. Now, when we got home, it was about 2:45 in the afternoon. About as soon as we opened the door, the phone started ringing, and it was that guy from the temp service. He said, "Hey, what are you doing in the next 15 minutes?" And I said, "Well, what do I need to be doing?" He said, "I've lined up an interview at 3 p.m. to meet with a guy who's a project manager for a Fortune 500 manufacturing company in the area." Well, to make a long story short, I went to the interview, I was hired on the spot, and started to work as a temp on Monday. Now, because of my previous experience, my starting pay was a little bit higher than the average of a temporary employee. And over the next couple of months, I got a couple of good raises as well. But I knew it was just a temp job, and that if they didn't hire me full time at that place, well, I was going to have to start my job search all over again. Now, let's fast forward 3 months. It was Friday, and it was the final day of the temp service contract, and it was quitting time. And I remember thinking to myself, well, I guess this is it. I'm going to have to start looking for another job. But just as I was getting ready to leave, the manager of the advanced manufacturing technologies team, he's actually R&D, walked over, stuck out his hand and said, "We'd like to offer you a full-time position." Now, of course, I immediately said yes to that offer, And he said, "You'll start on Monday with full benefits and 2 weeks paid vacation, and you'll be working for me." Now, of course, I was absolutely thrilled. I was relieved and was thankful that I'd landed a job for a great company with full benefits and a substantial pay increase. But over the weekend, I felt a bit, well, I guess you'd say, conflicted. It was starting to sink in that a whole era of my life was now over and what this type of change would mean for me. I knew that once I re entered that type of working environment, well, my speaking career was over. The joy of helping people from all walks of life, the freedom of working for myself, the experience of visiting all kinds of unique places, well, it was all over. Well, I knew that was exactly what I needed to do. I also had to acknowledge that I'd be confined to a building and most likely just to one specific area in that building. So I felt like I'd lost my identity, my freedom, and my entire way of life. I knew it would be a challenge to brush up on all those skills I'd left behind years before. I had to adapt to cutting edge technology now. I had to get used to the idea of having a boss again. I'd have to work hours I didn't like, doing things I wasn't crazy about, and often with people I wasn't too crazy about either. Now, it took me a few months, but I gradually readjusted to that type of work again. Did I miss my old career? You bet. In fact, years later, I still think about it every single day. But I learned, I adjusted, and I excelled in my new role and became a specialist in my field. And I stayed there for almost another 13 years and retired from that company. Now, looking back, those years were really tough in every way imaginable. I always thought of myself as being resilient. As a kid, I was a military brat and then an airline brat, so transfers and, reassignments were just common. So I learned to adapt really quickly to wherever we were. Fortunately, that translated easily into being a full-time speaker and adapting to different demographics and locations and constant changes that go along with that type of life. But here's what I learned. First, you don't really know how resilient you are until you face things that are totally out of the realm of your experience. And you're probably more resilient than you're giving yourself credit for. Second, it's a good thing to have a skill that you can fall back on, even if you never plan on doing that type of work again. You never know when something may happen and you have to use that skill, and it might be the very thing that pulls you out of a very deep, dark, rough spot. Third, unless it relates to your new career, no one really cares about what you've done in the past. They don't really care about your accomplishments and accolades or any of that. While it's okay to mention it, don't be annoying and don't be seen as a grieving has-been. In over a decade, I only shared with a handful of people about my previous career because it was irrelevant. Now, fourth, you may or may not face an identity crisis. While it's okay to miss a previous career, just don't sink into self-pity. You've got to look at the present and the future, not what used to be. There's no back there to go back to. And last, every career change has trade-offs. For example, there was a tremendous freedom in being a speaker, but I had to hustle all the time, endure the lean times, and have a flexible schedule, to say the least. But I found that having regular hours and at least a sense of financial security really helped a lot. Plus, I had new goals to pursue and now I had new dreams to chase. Now, if you'd like to hear a little bit more about career change, then check out this video.